I'm so ready. Okay, not quite ready. All right, now I'm ready. Let me share my screen, and I don't know how we want to facilitate this discussion, but I added some slides because I was really excited to share just the architecture of how this would work. Um, so I have some diagrams and stuff to talk about there, and then I was going to demo it, and then we can get into all the pros, cons, what ifs discussion, which I've added some initial thoughts here at the end. Probably is good for us to use the agenda, like if we're gonna maybe add things. So I'm just gonna go forward. I'm fine if you want to interrupt me. Let's see what happens. Okay. So if you want to take a look at it, here's the top two links are the code changes for this effort. There is the GitLab VSCode package, which we're going to dive into what that is in a little bit. And then there's just the MR for hooking it into where the Web IDE is currently loading. We load this package. And then this is a very helpful reference to the official VSCode extension API, all the things that are possible from there. You see interesting namespaces like terminal and custom web views. So there's a whole lot of possibilities that hasn't been touched in this effort, but are quite possible looking at what other extensions can do. Yeah, so I want to dive into the architecture, and then we're going to go to the demo. So the main thing that we're adding in this effort is a package, which I'm just calling GitLab VSCode. And there's two things going on with this package. There's modules that you import for it to bootstrap everything onto an element. But then there's assets it needs to host. So it hosts a web build of VS Code, and we just get this from the web. It's completely untouched. But then it also needs to host a place for our custom extension to live. So we have other node modules that we actually host assets from. So we kind of just copied what we were doing from SourceGraph over to this similar package where we have a module that we can import that gets bundled into our GitLab front end. It's very, very small. But most of it just creates an iframe, which then loads these self-hosted files. Any questions or thoughts about this? Okay. All right. Diving into this package. The things that we're adding here is this main entry point bundle, which takes in context information like what project and ref and what's the GitLab URL, and also builds this extension that we self-host. And so the way that this works is there's multiple, and there's another way of viewing this too. But there is the runtime environment that we're in when we start up the page, and we have access to all the DOM features and all of our GitLab context. And that's what this index.js gets access to, the main runtime environment. Extensions get access to very specific extension runtime environment. And so the main context initializes just the main VS Code modules. And there's some customization we can actually do there, like turning off features by just replacing what modules that get dependency injected because they use a special loader that lets us do that. But all of that then initializes under the hood this extension runtime. And that's actually how we're able to do things like register file systems and source control providers and things like that. Any questions about this? Any thoughts about it? So I want to show you just a little bit what that looks like. So it's a little more tangible. You all can still see my screen, I'm assuming. And I'm also assuming you can still hear me because I'm just going to keep talking. So here, this is like the main entry point method to this package where we create this iframe. And from the iframe, we actually can inject, we're actually going to inject the configure information we were started with, which contains like what project we're loading, what ref we're loading, and things like that. When I said we can actually do a level of customization here, um, VS Code uses AMD to load their modules, which means that we can kind of actually redefine modules. They have great architecture, which anything that's going to be contributing to the main engine are in these contribution modules. So I've done something where I'm actually just completely disabling this kind of feature by looping through these modules and just saying that these are no op modules. They're not going to actually do anything. So this actually changes the behavior of it rather than starting up all of this welcome to VS Code content, which isn't really appropriate for GitLab. We can kind of just turn that off. Um, this isn't this is a last resort if there's certain behaviors we want to customize, because all of this is really tying into implementation details of the VS Code package, not necessarily their official extension API. But it is still very possible to make some customizations like this. I wanted to show that, and I wanted to show what the extension runtime looks like. Extension runtime looks like a module that exports this activate function, and you have access to this glorious VS Code object where you can execute commands and do stuff like that. So I just want to give a brief view of what these two environments look like and how these are two kind of controls where we can create the behavior, try to create the behavior that we want. Pausing for effect. Okay, moving on. Yeah, so this is just diving into what the extension API looks like. So if you're gonna mess with the very first thing that happens with an extension is VS Code runtime will actually read the package JSON for what is this extension contributing to the whole workbench. And that includes things like commands, special views, and all of it is actually is just declared in this JSON, and you may actually fill in the details in the activation method of your extension. So all of this all of these functions are well documented in their extension API documentation, which I linked to earlier in here. And there's a whole freaking lot you could do, which is really cool. So this is how we get our file system providers and file search providers and things like that. Yeah, so here's the really here's one of the biggest challenges I ran into this and was super stoked to find the fix for it, which is actually really simple. I was really concerned there was going to be a very complicated fix, but it's actually simple. So the extensions are in a severe sandbox. Like, they run in a web worker with global functions rewritten. Extensions have a really hard time reaching outside of themselves, which is a good thing. But in our situation, we want to register a file system provider with the actual files of whatever project they've loaded. So that information is coming from the GitLab front end. How do we get that information into the extension runtime environment? And most extensions don't do this, where they're trying to read from outside their environment. Most extensions need their own setup. Like our GitLab, our official VS Code extension does this, where like the official GitLab extension for VS Code, you have to register a token and things like that. And we don't need to do that. We technically have all that authentication information. We don't want to do that because we want to create a very seamless experience. And so the mediator actually commands when we create the VS Code, when we bootstrap all this from that iframe that I showed earlier, you can actually list commands that any extension can reference to execute whatever you want. And so we're actually just treating these commands as a very thin mediator layer of making whatever fetch requests that we may need specifically for like getting the file content or getting the file tree. We're able to do that from when we bootstrap VS Code, and then the extension is able to use those commands when it executes the command, it's sending that to the main VS Code runtime. VS Code goes back to our main context, or from our main context, we can actually reach out to the backend, and all of that information gets passed back down to the extension. So that was a really nice find, because I was looking into some really weird workarounds. But thankfully, we can expose things from the outside world into extension world using commands. That's about it for heavy architecture stuff. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts about this?
There are 3 objects in that diagram, and the 2 in the middle, GitLab/VSCode and at GitLab/VSCode/public/VSCode. They sound very similar. So what could you remind me the difference again?
Yep. Thanks for asking that question. So I've tried to highlight in here, blue are things that we actually are developing. White is something, and so in this case, this is just the VS Code build of that we're packaging, but we're not necessarily touching. So the actual npm package looks like this. It looks like this, where we have the package JSON. Our main is this start module, but then these are the hosted files, which contain the VS Code build that we don't need to touch, but contains the extension, which we do create, and then just the main method for the iframe to load and stuff. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Yeah. So last little thing I want to show is, like, I'm gonna demo, and this is just what I've done with this demo is mostly take the file system and Git implementations that was done for the Web IDE POC and glue that into the VS Code API. So what's really exciting about the extension architecture is we have a whole, like, in-memory file system that's nothing to do with Visual Studio or VS Code. But then we have VS Code is able to read from that in-memory file system, and we have in-memory Git source control. There's nothing to do with VS Code, but we have these glue modules for the actual VS Code API. But there's a lot more we could do from just the UI perspective. This is just a screenshot of some of the things you can extend in the workbench. There's a lot, but it is really restrictive. So that is that's something to keep in mind. These things that are highlighted are kind of like the biggest things you can change from the UI perspective. You can also add, you can, like, pop up messages and pop up, like, dialogue forms that the user may have to go through, but that's about it from the UI perspective. But let's dive into the demo.
Dennis, you want to say something about that before we move on?
Yeah, go for it. I can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Will it be better?
Yes, you're good.
Yep, cool. Thank you. I'm sorry. So you've mentioned the in-memory version control. How is it realized on the?
So this is honestly, like, mostly copied from the POC, the state redesign POC that we made. Here we go.
I mean, is it custom written thing, or is it does it come with VS Code?
Yep, just like the state redesign is, and so the source control and, like, what Git does as an algorithm, it's not a lot. It's just really elegant, and so this is just an implementation of how Git manages source control, and rather than keeping track of it, it calculates it based on Git object hashes in this Merkle tree and stuff.
And we do it in memory.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. Does this mean that we will have the changes, like we will preserve the changes should the reload or crash, or like not crash probably, but if the reload happens, will we preserve this, or this memory is really like
That's a great
temporary?
idea, and that's a great question. We totally could, and because at the end of the day, it is just what's called just Git objects. It is just these hashes that have their own kind of content. The types look like this, where object is either a tree or a blob, and the data is, if it's a tree, it has children. If it's a blob, it has content. And you could totally, store this and load it up. And that's how diffs are calculated, is just what's the difference between two objects. And yeah, so we could preserve changes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So here I am in GitLab. I got GitLab running. Let's hope this doesn't break. I'm just going to open up the Web IDE, which we all know and love. And this thing is loading. And oh my gosh, it's so different now. So I loaded the main GitLab project really fast compared to with the Web IDE, with the current Web IDE. I'm going to do it again in case you missed it. This loads really fast, all of the file, and I'm ready to go. And I can search through everything and make whatever changes I want to. We could dive into later on. We could talk about the performance. One of the things that makes this a lot faster, even though there's a lot more going on, is that it's not using Vue. Vue reactivity is actually a really huge burden on the current Web IDE. So we're able to load the entire file tree, create this structure, opening up things is really fast, and it works. So I'm gonna make a change. And oh man, I don't have Vim. All right, I'm not gonna, there's no way I'm doing this without Vim. So let's just go to the extension marketplace and install Vim. Side note about this extension marketplace. We actually are doing, so we're actually, and this is what other kind of VS Code clones do. Not clones isn't the right word, but this is kind of what other VS Code like instances do, like Gitpod. Rather than pulling from the main VS Code extension marketplace, it pulls from OpenVSX. Because otherwise, VS Code has set up really strict cores around fetching from their marketplace. That's kind of lame from VS Code, but it's kind of nice that there's community efforts to make the subsidiary systems more open source friendly. So we're able to overwrite what extension gallery we use. And so rather than pulling from the main VS Code marketplace, this pulls from OpenVSX, which I guess is like somehow like a clone of it. It's what Gitpod uses. But let's install Vim because that's why we're all here. And now Vim is installed. So now, yeah, we're ready. Okay, I'm just gonna make some changes. Okay, cool. So now we see we got some changes and we're keeping track of this thing, which is exciting. So I can right click, I can open a preview. I can also, make split tabs. All of this lovable editing experience that we take for granted in our local environments is just out of the box with using VS Code. I'm going to go ahead and undo the changes. And let's double check that the source control does its thing, and it did its thing. So now there's no changes. This is one of the downsides. The source control, we do not have a whole lot of flexibility of what we can present here. We have some ideas for how we could make users that aren't familiar with this UI have more of a call to action. There's actually a proposed API to just create a call to action button here that we could probably take advantage of. We're already using one of the proposed APIs, which is working nicely. I don't have the commit implemented. but probably how we would implement like picking a branch and whether we want to open MR is through VS Code has like a quick they call it quick pick. I haven't implemented it, but it basically lets you create, yeah, you can like open a dialogue and you can create like a little form that the user has to go through to finish some sort of command. So we could do something similar. That's how I think we would implement the options, our current commit options. But yeah, this is all works really fast, and like I can delete I'm just gonna delete a whole folder real fast, and that's no problem. I can rename things, and we don't run into the content being erased or the weird file changes that we run into sometimes, because our source control and our file system are strictly separated, so that if I've changed something, renamed it, and all that stuff, I don't run into the bugs that currently plague our Web IDE. That's about it from a demo. Does anyone wanted me to try something out?
I might have missed this, but I assume the committing and pushing to the repo works totally fine, right?
Yeah, so I haven't implemented that, but there's nothing that would stop it from working, because this data, the diff data, is all there, and the Git. There's still some to-dos to wrap up here, but I was mainly wanting to see, are there any blockers that's going to prevent this from working? And the answer is no. There's still some things we need to do, but yeah, committing would work totally fine. The user flow would look different than how it currently does, because there's not right now a very clear call to action button. I think there's a way we could add it. That's something that we can investigate. I'm pretty sure, because I think I even included a link to it. There's a proposed API for that. But then also like picking the branch and seeing if we want to do an MR, those will have to be like native VS Code dialogues. We could possibly create like a view modal that goes over this, because we still have that context that we can, the outside of this iframe context, that we can do things. But yeah, anyone else have any other questions?
I do. First of all, I've been waiting so long to see VS Code here in the Web IDE. This is so amazing. Thank you. Yeah. A few questions. The search on the left sidebar, if you go into that, does it work as expected, or are there any restrictions?
This is a really good question. So out of the box, this works just with the files you've opened. You can register a file content search provider, but that would require more of an infrastructure than we have. So if I, yeah, let me see if I can front end. Yeah. So now when I search for front end, I'm going to get things for only the files I've opened. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yes. Thank you.
Yep.
Next question. Right now, what would happen if you would go to the place where usually the terminal would be?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So right now it's just blank, and I think you can create like a welcome view for this, saying like this doesn't work. This is also something we can look into to see, are we able to, like, from the dependency injection side, like just totally turn this kind of thing off. Some of the things that you would think you could do that for, you can't. So that's one downside to this, is there's a lot of features we're not using, and how we want to present those and what level of display / noise we're comfortable with is a good question. There is a cool little output terminal that we can take advantage of like, we're running tasks or whatever we're trying to do. We can output whatever we want here, which is kind of cool. And I think we can even put things out here into like the problems view.
I have a question. So we have like VS Code provides a lot of APIs to extend the workbench, but do we have APIs? I know this is very related to what you already said, but it's like what mechanisms do we have to hide parts of the UI? For example, besides the terminal panel, we also have this debug panel
Yeah.
to the left.
I
Can we hide
want,
this?
yeah, I really wanted to figure out how to hide this. I was able to for some other ones, and for some of these was a little bit more hidden than I could figure out how to. But there's the capabilities there because I can functionally do this. So it's a matter of kind of figuring out how is VS Code doing this internally? Do they expose something publicly? We could do that. There's a little bit of spelunking in their code. It is a good question. That's the kind of challenges that we do have, and it's very doable. I've done it with some of the features already, but there's clearly a lot more that we can do here.
I want to highlight
actually-
something on that. Sorry, go ahead, Edward.
So how likely is it that if we actually need this sort of customization, we're going to have to fork VS Code? This is something that we talked about last week as well. But it's like now that you have like more experience trying to customize the workbench in this way, have your opinion changed about having to fork VS Code?
I don't think we'll need to fork VS Code. I think that we can use their dependency injection through their modules to change their contributions. I think that will be pretty good. There's some projects I've seen that straight up don't necessarily fork it, but are basically like a patch file for how we patch VS Code to do things that we want it to do. I mean, that would be ultimate last resort. I don't see it being necessary. When I look at things in the wild like Gitpod and VSCode.dev, VSCode.dev is the biggest proof of concept of this because this is the architecture that they're using, and they're not manually manipulating VS Code, and so whatever VSCode.dev does to create that just pure front end only editing environment, there's not really anything that prevents us. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
There are also plenty of questions in the agenda document.
Yeah. So what do you think is a good way to go forward? So I have like just some pros and cons of thoughts that I have out, and then maybe we can just talk about in general. Do you want me to go through this and then we go through agenda discussions?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, I'm not even gonna talk a lot. This is just me dumping my thoughts about all this. Okay. From a reliability and a usability perspective, this is so much beyond the current Web IDE editing experience that it's really great that how the quality we get out of the box is a big win. From a usability perspective, the fact that I can install a Vim extension, this means I'm really happy as a user. From a maintainability perspective, like this isn't a lot of code just to get our part running. So there's a whole lot we're doing in the Web IDE to kind of recreate the wheel, which VS Code already has. So like this current package, it doesn't have any tests, but it's like 3,000-ish lines of code, where our Web IDE directory is like 16,000 lines of code. And it's possible we can actually do more with the VS Code package than we could with the current Web IDE because of how tightly coupled things are in the Web IDE. And that goes into also just a lot of the API is just they have really great abstractions for how we can extend parts of the view and in a reliable way. Very huge feature, super excited about. If we do this, we can even look at beefing up the GitLab workflow, the official VS Code extension, to run natively alongside this, to completely change what does it mean to open up the Web IDE in an MR, so that we can actually add comments from within that editing experience. And it could be really exciting. And so Tomas, who has paired with me, Enrique has paired with me on this a bit, but Tomas, who's contributed a lot to this POC already, he already created a web build of this extension. But it still has to go through the workflow of like registering a token and things like that. So there's work to be done if we wanted to make that be able to live alongside this native experience, but it's very doable. There's a huge performance win, as we've seen just with me editing this, that this is a lot faster than the Web IDE. Some cons is the UI is very restricted to what they let us do. A lot of the code is out of our control, so that is a maintainability concern, and especially if we're tempted to touch into implementation details, those are concerns. And then also from a usability perspective, like the Web IDE having less features means that users don't necessarily run into shooting themselves in the foot by configuring and extending things in a bad way. So the fact that things are so customizable in this environment, from the user perspective, it's possible that for users looking for just a simple interface, that could be lost. And we could try to see what things we can do to improve that, and I think there's some things we can do, but it's definitely not as under control. Here's a bunch of what ifs of if we wanted to do this kind of thing, and some discussions about that. But I'm going to put a pause here and we can talk about the agenda questions. Does that sound good? Okay, I'm going to move over to the agenda.
I'm going to voice over Michael. I captured a couple of the comments on Marcel's and Enrique's questions in the agenda, but if you want to go back through and fill out any more detail, feel free. We have the recording too, so you don't have to. Michael had a comment, I believe, in the issue about customizing the UI. This is the hot topic, and like 4 of my other questions are going to be related to this. But to what extent is it possible to get the GitLab look and feel? And Marcel, you can talk to this a little more in the question here, but how themable? Can we have a default theme for GitLab? Can we change the icons to be GitLab's UI icons? Things like that would go a long way to making people feel comfortable while we maintain the workflow of VS Code and get the power of VS Code. So how realistic is that? I don't know, Marcel, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great topic, and I'm still not 100% sure how much users will expect more of a GitLab experience and more of a VS Code experience. I'm really, really unsure about these things. I think it could go either way. And it's a very interesting piece to tackle. So my question is more like, how much flexibility do we have? And because you put customizability at the con, I want to also have a question. Do you mean customizability from the user side? Can they make it more complex for themselves? Is that why you meant it as a con? Or because we don't have much customizability?
I meant it from the user side, and I meant that a lot of the baked-in use cases are for users to customize their experience. So it's like that adds just by nature a level of complexity to the user workflow. There's a whole lot you could do to try to alleviate that, like help messages with call to actions and things like that. Like there's tactics there. But one of the what ifs is, what if the user really does just shoot themselves in the foot? Like they configure the heck out of this thing and now it's completely unusable. What do we do in that use case? And I had some ideas for how we can address that, but those are some of the problems we'd run into, which we just don't today because we don't have that capability. So it's customizability is a two-edged sword. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Would any customization that the user does to the interface and the settings actually survive a reload? Is that all stored in local storage, or would we have to store that in somewhere in the user profile?
Yeah, so that is stored in local storage, and
Mhm.
we can find a way to persist it because it's VSCode.dev does that. They'll tie it to your GitHub account, and will persist across all of your VS Code instances. So we could do something very similar to where we persist all
Would
of
we
my-
be able to have, for example, a standard set of extensions pre-installed on a project or group level
Yeah,
with
yeah.
that
And in
approach
fact,
too?
yep. In fact, the VS Code project should actually, I haven't tried this out, but it should be smart enough to read from the VS Code directory and do fancy stuff from there too.
Okay.
Like automatically setting itself up.
I think
Very cool for
GitHub does
existing
exactly that as well.
users. Yeah, that's very cool. Chad, you had a point about the customization. Did he address that, or did you want to voice it over?
No, I was just like, one of the points I'd heard is like the concern about users overly customizing it. And like, especially for IDEs, that's not a concern at all for me. And the link that I put is like DHH's stance on Rails from 2012, which seems to have worked out, which is like, here's what you get out of the box. We're very opinionated about that. You can do other stuff. If you break things by doing that, then maybe you should go back to what you get out of the box, but they're both okay because one size never fits all.
Yeah, that's going to be a double-edged sword for us, I believe, if we go in this direction. But I appreciate, Paul, that you've also already thought about it, documented it, and I was talking with Tomas, and I know you're brainstorming, like, what if we had like a hard reset button or like a nuke all my customizations kind of workflow to get us back into a clean state, which makes a lot of sense. I'll kind of gloss over the next one because I wrote it before I saw the slides. We can talk about it async. It seems like it's possible, but this, I guess, ties into one of my next point if I skip over about consistency. So we've been working over the past year to try and wrap our heads around the idea that we have source editor as a single editing experience and consistency across the Web IDE, the web editor, snippets, pipeline editor, and everywhere else that it's used. And this is intentionally and very clearly breaking away from that consistency, which may be okay, but we need to like think about what that means, not just in like the consistency of the theme or like how the diff view looks, but also are we adding features to the web editor, like being able to open the content editor and edit in a WYSIWYG environment, or even just like the ability to jump to the individual line of code, or maybe we introduce merge request discussions as like little bubbles in the gutter or something like that. We're going to end up having to duplicate that effort, and we may never be able to achieve parity or consistency in a way that feels like it's all GitLab, right? So that's one of my big concerns. I don't know if there's an answer to that other than what you've already talked about, but maybe.
I think there is. I think if we go this route, VS Code's architecture does not block us to achieving this goal of drawing a thick line between our core functionality and VS Code glue code. And so that's one of the things I was wanting to highlight with, like, we have a file system and Git source control that is decoupled from VS Code completely. There's nothing that would prevent us from packaging that separately, reusing that in snippets or something like that. And I think the content editor would be very similar. And because VS Code has to be so flexible, and so they quote use cases like, having a 3D model editor and things like that. Like, because it has to be so flexible, we'd be able to just completely reuse the content editor. But it does bring up questions from like a packaging perspective. Right now, we have everything living in the GitLab project. If I need to reuse something in this GitLab VSCode package, like that's going to have to kind of be in its own package. And like, so from a packaging perspective, it brings up those challenges. But there's nothing that stops us from having our core functionality shared, and VSCode is just glue code.
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, as we move forward on this, I should preface, I'll go back and talk high level, but as we move forward, I think that'd be one of the next steps for like architecture and proof of concepts, maybe giving some very specific examples of things we want to accomplish over the next couple of years with the web editor, if we were to have two separate editing environments, and see how we might approach doing it consistently. So I should have started by saying, first of all, thank you for your hard work on this, and it is amazing. And I know I was the first to be skeptical of this approach a couple months ago when we started talking about, when Marcel had an issue that was like, we should maybe think about Gitpod's new open VS Code server project. I was a little maybe overly skeptical, not because I think it's a bad idea, but I'm nervous about the implications. And I'm especially nervous about that project in the infrastructure, our ability to support the infrastructure. What you've done here is shown that it's possible to do that without messing up our infrastructure. So I think that's, first of all, very impressive, and I'm very appreciative of your diligence there and your recommendation to even look into this. So I'm putting a bunch of things that sound skeptical. I'm actually very, very encouraged by this. So I don't want you to think I'm raking you over the coals for it, or if I'm falling on one side of the fence or not. That being prefaced, consistency is a big concern. We've talked about that. The loading, which I think Dennis has a similar question here. So loading was fast. That alone almost sold me on the whole thing, and I want to just have it now. I'd love to see it quantified on larger MRs, because I know that's a big challenge we have with the Web IDE today and with loading MRs to begin with. So something that I can point to and say, like, Web IDE opens this large MR in 7.8 seconds and VS Code opens it in 1.3 or something like that, right? Like that alone would be a great way to measure this. But I'm curious to maybe just discuss quickly, because we're running out of time, are there approaches we could take to the current Web IDE to get to this point? Or are we as fast as we're going to get?
That's a really good question. And the state redesign is the first step for sure. Well, I don't want to say for sure, but I'm going to say it for sure. But then view reactivity does not work well for large amounts of data. And the way that our current state works, the way that this state works, is every single file object, whether it's a tree or file, is an object. And our current Web IDE, it's a humongous object. So we take up like a gig of memory when we open up the GitLab project in the Web IDE, because Vue has to create so many freaking functions about it. So I say state redesign is definitely a first step, but we're still quite limited because of Vue reactivity. Vue 3 lets us be a little bit more in control of Vue reactivity. And so those are big efforts. Yeah, that's the path forward I see.
Appreciate that. Last bit before I let Dennis run through, I just wanted to ask about extensions, because that's the other part that makes me nervous. Not just overextending the experience and making it feel disjointed, but literally managing extensions and having an extension manager in there. It's I think there's even a product principle somewhere that, like, we don't want plugins and stuff like that in our product. So we would need to be really intentional about that experience. Can we even do anything about that experience? Should we decide that that is not the place for it? If we, for example, wanted to pull those extensions into the main UI and limit them in some way, or some, I'm being extreme, but like, can we do that?
I think so. If I can replace the extent, yes, I'm sure we can. If I can replace the extension gallery, I'm sure we can also just empty out the extension gallery. I would be really surprised if you couldn't. Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a good point, and maybe that's one of the safest things we can do.
I'm not saying we should, or it's just nice to know that we can. All of this is going to require some validation. I'll just cut to my next step is going to be probably taking this with Michael and getting some user feedback, user validation. And I expect a lot of these similar things to come up. But we got 12 minutes, give or take. I'll let Dennis run through his questions too.
Could I just make one
Oh yeah,
follow-up comment on that? So, I mean, that's a really good point. Do we want people to be able to customize it or not? And I think that's like the giant elephant in the room from a product perspective. And to me, it's like, do we want this to be a real IDE, or do we just want it to be a file editor? And if we're going to have to let people extend it and customize it the way they want if we want the former. And if that's an exception to GitLab's conventions of not letting people customize it, I mean, we need to answer that question sooner than later and explicitly.
I mean,
That's
honestly,
it.
I would say my take on this is not just to address it. My take right now, my gut says not to limit the types of extensions that can be installed, but that installing them within the context of the IDE is not the best place to do it. And if anything, I would advocate for some centralized or project level, group level extension management view for the IDE. And we kind of just like bring that registry in to our UI. That's maybe ridiculous. That's maybe a terrible idea, but that would probably be the only alternative.
Okay, I'll try to ask all the questions. First of all, thanks a lot, Paul. It was really amazing, especially if we check the POC and the number of changes that were required to include this into the main product is plus 90 minus 3. That's super impressive. That's mind-blowing. The point is that we are like VS Code is super cool, super nice. The problem is there are two problems. First of all, not everybody is the developer, meaning VS Code interface won't tell them anything. It will be just perceived as completely new interface for those users. And the second one, even among the developers, not everybody is the VS Code user. Like I'm JetBrains user. Of course, I know how VS Code looks, but I'm not familiar with all the keystrokes and things like this. So to me, it would, again, still be the new experience that I have to learn. But when it comes to customizations, like, building own UI things and make it more GitLab friendly, my personal opinion is that this might confuse even those who have experience with VS Code. It's like, if we make this VS Code and we cater at least to one group of our potential users right out of the box, if we try to customize, like not allow users to customize, but I mean our own customizations of the UI elements, if we do it too hard, then we will create completely new interface that is not familiar to anybody, and it will be the new experience for everybody. So we have to be careful with that, I think. It's just a comment, not a question, but just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, that's the main question at hand. Is like there's a trade-off of all the usability wins is at the trade-off of this is the experience, this is the workflow, and we can't change that too much. That's the big question: is are we okay with that? Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. So the second one, I've just missed the point where why we are using iframes. So Paul reply
Yeah.
in line.
So the VS Code modules, I haven't tried it without an iframe, but all of their examples and internal things, they're loading. VS Code has control of the whole document, and so that we can keep our GitLab nav bar and our main outside context from getting touched, we create a dynamic iframe with basically bootstraps the web view. Yeah, and I was concerned about running into resizing issues, but those seems to be actually okay.
In all browsers.
I've tried Chrome and Firefox.
Okay,
yeah,
that's enough, I guess.
I don't have Safari anymore.
Well, lucky you. Okay, so thanks for replying to this one. But the third one goes back to the discussion of the Web IDE, whether we are able to achieve the same, or we won't get the same speed, but at least comparable speed to. Wait a second, I've skipped. So this next one was about using the same memory version control for the current Web IDE. So and yeah, Paul, do you want to just
using the extensions?
But in this particular POC,
yes,
is it the extension?
Yes. The same memory version control. Yeah, the main blocker to all this is the state redesign, and because in fact the file system and memory version control that I've used for this spike is like 80% the same as the original state redesign POC. So now it's just has the glue code to VS Code, and I added type stuff because now when I write TypeScript, I feel like I have to add types everywhere.
So do you understand that what you're saying is that once you're done with the state redesign, we will have this?
Yes, but the big question is, do we do this? Do we invest in the state redesign if we're planning on doing?
Well, we are 80%. We are 80% there, right?
Well, it's easy to plug this into VS Code because VS Code has good state abstractions. We can't plug this into the Web IDE because there's so much coupling and duplication of our state. We're not even in a place where we're calculating diffs. So that's the state redesign is two parts. One is creating the in-memory file system and source control, which is kind of already there. But then also the state redesign is all about refactoring Web IDE state so we can use those. And that's a lot of work. Whereas with VS Code, it's like no work. It's just there.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I will just briefly go because the two next ones are really interesting. So first of all, are you aware of any legal implications of us using all those extensions? That's because that's pretty interesting question, and I'm sure we have to run it through the legal because I don't know if they are all MIT, then probably we should be fine. But just to double check whether that's the case. Yeah, so legal has to, and the problem is that I bet legal would hate us for asking this because they would need to go through every single extension in the marketplace to determine whether we are allowed to use that or another extension. But that's another story. That's a completely different story. So have you heard about any legal issues with this?
That's a really good question. I think it would depend on like if something is compiled into the source control or like because people can host, and we have live preview. So like technically it's legal for someone to create a GPL licensed live preview project and run that live preview. Do you know what I mean? So it's definitely a legal question. It's possible they wouldn't have to go through every extension because the nature of how extensions are run, just like the nature of how we like run pipelines and stuff. But I don't really know. It's a great question.
Do you mean those extensions get compiled elsewhere? They're not compiled in our hardware?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't know. I'm not I'm not
Okay.
a person.
Okay, cool. Like, but anyway, this is beyond
Yeah,
the
it's a great
discussion.
question though.
But the second one is really interesting. Like, have you considered running this as the standalone app as like VS Code dev? So how I see this is we just have another option for those who want to have full size dev environment, and we just provide them with this just like VS Code dev, with this environment where they can do whatever they want. Because my main concern is that for those who are not developers, who are not particularly savvy with the editors, we might still want to provide some lightweight version where they keep working, and that version might be Web IDE. But for those hardcore developers, we just provide the separate domain, and they just go there and do whatever they want. The main question is only how to connect that to their repositories to allow them to access their repositories. But that's, again, just connecting the API endpoints and be done with that.
Yeah, and that's doable, and that's a great question. And I mean, we've talked about having like ide.gitlab.com to like open up the Web IDE before, and so we could do something really similar for this. I think the biggest concern is, do we want to maintain this, the Web IDE, and like it's just a big, that would be the trade-off if we were looking at adding this as opposed to replacing it. But it's a good question. I don't know.
Well, for some period of time, we would still have, like, if you mean by the trade-off, you mean we would need to support like 3-4 different editors. That would still be the case even if we replace, because it's not going to happen over time that we replace everything with just VS Code, right? So it will still happen. The point is that if it is the separate thing, it's much more maintainable than like doing this and getting into all sorts of regressions as we go. So that's just, and once we prove that things work fine on the separate domain and people do like this and people do want to use this, that's when we might make the decision to replace the existing thing. It's just, to give some, to allow some iteration into the process.
Yeah, that's a great question of like, do we want to just feature flag this, or do we want to support both for a time? Like, that's a great question too. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not eager to, if we have this environment, I'm not eager to continue supporting the Web IDE, because it's like the Web IDE has a lot of issues like that's fundamentally plaguing it for many use cases, and the more we have to support and try to fix those bugs, the less we're able to invest in maybe solving usability problems with this VS Code environment. But I do like the idea of, rather than just feature flagging it, maybe allowing users to pick for a time and figuring that out. That would be interesting. That's definitely a question to consider.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so my next question is not gonna happen today. It's anyway.
Well,
it has been addressed already.
I was just gonna say, you all can stay on. I want to be respectful of people's time. Let's stop the recording. We can answer these in async manner, or whoever wants to stay on can keep chatting if that's okay with Paul. I'm gonna step out, but again, thank you, Paul. Thanks everybody for your great questions and input. We'll figure out next steps and document them in issues and try and post this video as soon as it's available, rendering and stuff like that.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
I'm still here if you guys